What if the war that ended the Nazi regime wasn't won by armies or tanks, but by whispers, coded messages, and invisible hands moving in the dark? Most people know about the storming of Normandy or the fall of Berlin, but few realize that behind every major victory, there was a secret world of spies, ordinary people who risked everything to feed intelligence, sabotage supply lines, and turn the Nazi war machine against itself. These weren't James Bond-style agents in tuxedos. They were farmers, cryptographers, couriers, and even Nazi officers themselves, each one part of an intricate web of deception that stretched across continents. Their names rarely make the history books, but without them, World War II might have ended very differently. During the 1940s, Nazi Germany built what was thought to be the most powerful and disciplined intelligence system in the world. But the Allies had something far more dangerous, networks of spies that the Nazis never truly saw coming. These networks didn't just leak information, they rewired the war. Messages smuggled through false bottom suitcases. Codes cracked by mathematicians working in frozen huts. Radio transmissions disguised as weather reports, every intercepted message and hidden microfilm slowly chipped away at the Nazi empire from the inside. One of the most mind-blowing facts about this secret war is how early it began. Years before the Allied invasion of Europe, Nazi agents were already infiltrating foreign governments and industries, and yet those very efforts ended up exposing their weaknesses. Every spy the Nazis sent out became a potential leak back into their own system. And by the time Hitler realized the scale of the problem, it was far too late. These secret networks weren't just gathering facts, they were shaping decisions. Without them, the D-Day landings might have been a slaughter. Without them, Allied bombers would have missed key targets. And without them, the Nazis might have unleashed secret weapons before anyone could stop them. The truth is, while soldiers fought on the front lines, spies were fighting an invisible war that determined how and when those battles would be won. But who were these mysterious people? How did they operate under the eyes of one of the most brutal regimes in history? And how did networks made of civilians and double agents manage to outsmart the most feared intelligence service in Europe? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the spy networks that took down the Nazis, from the cryptographers who cracked their codes to the underground escape lines that outwitted the Gestapo, to the double agents who fed Hitler lies so convincing they changed the course of the war itself. Because in the end, it wasn't just brute force that ended the Third Reich. It was intelligence, courage, and deception. But the first breakthrough didn't come from the battlefield. It came from something far more unexpected, a team of quiet geniuses who listened to the enemy's secrets before the world even knew a war had begun. Before the Allies could outsmart the Nazis, they had to understand them. And that started with one of the greatest code-breaking battles in history. Long before a single tank rolled across Europe, a handful of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptographers were already fighting an invisible war, one that would determine the fate of millions. In the 1930s, the Nazi regime relied on a machine that was said to be unbreakable, Enigma. Every day, its settings changed, producing millions of possible code combinations. The Nazis believed it was flawless, messages scrambled into gibberish that no enemy could ever decode. But in secret rooms across Europe, brilliant minds were determined to prove them wrong. The first cracks appeared not in Britain, but in Poland. 3 young mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Rojicki, and Henryk Zygalski, managed to break early versions of the Enigma code before the war even began. Their discoveries were smuggled out of Poland just weeks before the Nazi invasion, landing in British hands at a hidden estate called Bletchley Park. That's where a group of unassuming geniuses, led by the quiet but brilliant Alan Turing, turned math into a weapon. Working in freezing huts surrounded by secrecy and stress, Turing and his team built machines capable of decoding Nazi messages at lightning speed. Every intercepted transmission about troop movements, bombing plans, or submarine routes was like a glimpse into Hitler's mind. The information was so valuable, it was given a special classification, Ultra. And Ultra intelligence wasn't just helpful, it was decisive. One decoded message might save an entire convoy from a U-boat attack. Another could redirect Allied bombers to strike factories before the Nazis even knew they were targeted. By 1941, thanks to Turing's breakthroughs and the tireless work of thousands of codebreakers, the Allies were reading parts of Germany's secret communications almost in real time. It was like watching the enemy move across a chessboard and knowing every move before they made it. But not all the code breaking happened in Europe. Across the Atlantic, an American cryptologist named Elizabeth Friedman was quietly dismantling Nazi spy networks in South America. Her team decoded secret radio transmissions used by Nazi agents trying to manipulate neutral governments and ship war materials to Germany. Each message she cracked weakened Nazi influence and helped shut down dozens of enemy operations. What made these early victories so powerful was that they didn't rely on armies or weapons. They relied on intellect, patience, and nerve. The Nazis had built their empire on intimidation and fear. The codebreakers fought back with logic and silence. Still, even as Allied intelligence grew stronger, one crucial challenge remained. Information was useless unless someone could act on it. And that meant boots on the ground, agents who could slip behind enemy lines, move in secret, and turn decoded intelligence into action. Because cracking the codes was only half the battle. The real danger began once those secrets had to be delivered, face to face, under the watchful eyes of the Gestapo. And that's where the story takes us next, to the brave resistance networks who risked everything to carry those secrets across occupied Europe. While codebreakers were decoding Nazi secrets from afar, another war was raging right in the heart of occupied Europe. One fought in the shadows by ordinary civilians who turned their homes into safe houses and their lives into acts of defiance. These were the resistance networks, the silent arteries that kept information, people, and hope flowing through territories crushed under Nazi control. It started small. A smuggled letter here, a forged passport there. But as the Nazi grip tightened, these isolated acts of courage connected into vast underground webs stretching across countries. One of the most daring of these was the Comet Line, a network that began in Belgium and wound its way through France and Spain, helping downed Allied airmen escape back to Britain. It was run mostly by young civilians, students, farmers, even nuns, people who had no training in espionage but possessed something far more powerful, the will to fight back. Imagine it. You're a Belgian woman in your early 20s, like André de Jong, the founder of the Comet Line. German soldiers patrol every street. One wrong word could mean arrest or execution. Yet you guide lost airmen, dressed in rags, through forests and train stations, carrying forged papers and silent prayers. Every journey could be your last, but you go anyway. By 1944, de Jong's network had saved more than 800 Allied soldiers, and it wasn't just about escapes. Along the way, they gathered crucial intelligence, photographs of Nazi troop movements, factory locations, secret fortifications, all passed to British intelligence through underground channels. These networks blurred the line between rescuer and spy, and the Comet Line was only one of many. Across France, the Maquis organized sabotage missions, cutting phone lines, derailing trains, and ambushing convoys. In the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden relied heavily on Dutch resistance members who mapped German defenses and smuggled radio parts to Allied paratroopers. Even children were couriers, carrying coded messages tucked into loaves of bread or inside toy dolls. But resistance came with a price. The Gestapo's counterintelligence units hunted these networks relentlessly. Captured couriers were tortured, betrayed, and executed. Entire families vanished overnight. Yet even under that constant threat, new members kept joining. Every betrayal inspired two more to rise in defiance. One of the most remarkable aspects of these underground movements was their coordination. Messages decoded at Bletchley Park were often passed through these resistance networks, turning intercepted data into real-world sabotage. It was a two-way street. The spies and the civilians depended on each other. Without the resistance, the codebreakers' secrets stayed trapped on paper. Without the codebreakers, the resistance often acted blindly. Together, they became something unstoppable, a living, breathing intelligence machine. Still, even with courage flooding the underground, the Allies needed something more: insiders. People who weren't just resisting the Nazis from the outside, but undermining them from within their own ranks. And some of those insiders didn't just steal documents, they betrayed the Reich itself. Because while the resistance fought in the shadows of Europe, another, even more dangerous web was forming, one that reached deep into Hitler's inner circle. Every secret war needs soldiers of deception, and inside Nazi Germany, some of the most dangerous spies weren't working against the Allies. They were working inside the Reich itself. These weren't foreign agents parachuting into enemy territory. They were Germans, Austrians, and Europeans living under the Nazi flag, feeding critical intelligence straight to the Allies while pretending loyalty to Hitler's empire. One of the most notorious of these networks was known by a chilling name, the Red Orchestra. To the Gestapo, it sounded like a single coordinated spy ring. In reality, it was a tangled web of resistance groups scattered across Germany, Belgium, and France, connected not by orders, but by purpose. Each musician in this orchestra played their own part, some intercepting radio transmissions, others leaking military documents, and a few working in the very heart of the Nazi command. The Red Orchestra wasn't driven by money or orders from London. It was built on conscience. Many of its members were journalists, artists, and soldiers who saw the truth behind Hitler's lies. One of its key figures, Harro Schulze-Boysen, was a Luftwaffe officer who secretly supplied Allied intelligence with Nazi battle plans and reports of atrocities. From inside the German Air Ministry, he copied classified memos and relayed them to Soviet agents who passed them on to the Allies. To anyone watching, he looked like a model officer. In reality, he was dismantling the Nazi war effort one message at a time. Then there was Arvid Harnack, an economist who had access to high-level Nazi policies. He and his wife, Mildred, an American, used coded language in letters and diplomatic channels to smuggle out secrets. They warned of planned invasions, troop movements, and internal conflicts long before Allied spies on the ground could confirm them. Together, they risked, and eventually lost, everything to expose the Nazi system from within. The Gestapo's hunt for the Red Orchestra became a nightmare of paranoia and betrayal. Agents swept through cities, arresting hundreds. Radios were confiscated. Families disappeared. Yet, even as the network was brutally dismantled, the information it had already delivered was too valuable to be undone. Their reports gave the Allies insight into Nazi military operations, the morale inside Germany, and even the early outlines of the Holocaust. Years before, the world truly grasped its scale. What's most chilling is how close many of these spies operated to Hitler's core. Some worked in embassies, others in intelligence bureaus. A few even served as secretaries and aides to high-ranking Nazi officials. The higher they rose, the more dangerous their double lives became. Every coded message they sent was a roll of the dice between life and death. And yet, the Red Orchestra wasn't the only one. Across Europe, smaller, quieter infiltrations unfolded. Diplomats, translators, and officers passed microfilms hidden in fountain pens. A simple misstep, a flicker of fear, a wrong phrase, could mean the firing squad. These insiders proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, it's access. By turning the Nazi system against itself, they showed that betrayal could be a form of resistance. But espionage wasn't limited to Europe. Across the Atlantic, an entirely different kind of spy war was unfolding, one that Hitler himself didn't even realize was collapsing from the inside. Because before the Allies ever set foot in Normandy, Nazi espionage in America was already being exposed and dismantled by one of the largest spy takedowns in history. While Europe was burning, another war was happening in secret, this time right on American soil. Long before Pearl Harbor pulled the U.S. into the conflict, Nazi Germany had already planted dozens of spies across the country. Their mission? To steal military secrets, track ship movements, and prepare for potential sabotage against American industries. But what they didn't know was that their entire network was being watched from the inside. It all began with a man named Fritz Duquesne, a South African-born adventurer who had once fought against the British and later pledged loyalty to Hitler's Germany. He was charming, persuasive, and ruthless, the perfect recruiter. Under his leadership, a sprawling spy ring took shape, quietly embedding Nazi agents into American factories, ports, and even aviation companies. These weren't amateurs. They sent coded letters disguised as ordinary business correspondence, used invisible ink, and transmitted radio signals to Berlin. At its peak, Duquesne's network had 33 active operatives scattered across the U.S., feeding information about ship designs, aircraft production, and new weapon technologies. Some of it even reached the Nazi high command. But what none of them knew was that their carefully built empire had already been compromised by a man pretending to be one of their own. His name was William Siebold, a German-born American who had been pressured by the Gestapo to spy for Germany. Instead, he made a daring choice. He turned himself in to the FBI. Together, they crafted one of the most brilliant double-agent operations in U.S. history. Siebold set up a fake radio station in New York City, pretending to transmit Nazi intelligence overseas, while in reality, every single message went straight to the FBI. For nearly 2 years, the Bureau quietly listened, recorded, and collected evidence. Agents tracked secret meetings in cafes, coded messages mailed through New Jersey, and radio transmissions bouncing off the night sky. The Nazis thought their man in New York was loyal. In truth, Siebold and the FBI were dismantling their entire spy network piece by piece. In June 1941, the trap finally closed. The FBI swooped in, arresting all 33 members of the Duquesne spy ring in one coordinated operation. It was the largest espionage bust in American history, and it struck a devastating blow to Nazi intelligence just months before the U.S. officially entered the war. Every major operative was convicted, with sentences totaling over 300 years in prison. But the real victory wasn't just in the arrests. It was in what the operation revealed. Nazi Germany's desperate reach for power extended far beyond Europe. They wanted influence in South America, control over U.S. industries, and eyes inside every nation they could infiltrate. And thanks to one man's courage and the FBI's precision, they lost all of it before it could do lasting damage. Still, for every spy network exposed, another was forming. Across Europe, the war of deception only grew darker. The Nazis had been humiliated abroad, but inside occupied territory, they were about to strike back. Because the next phase of the intelligence war wouldn't be fought by the Allies, it would be waged by the Nazi counterintelligence machine itself, a ruthless force determined to turn Allied spies into pawns. For every secret Allied victory in the shadows, there was a darker truth behind it. The Nazis were learning. By the middle of the war, Hitler's counterintelligence machine had become one of the most feared forces in Europe. Their mission was simple: find the spies, break the networks, and feed false information back to London. And for a time, they succeeded in ways that stunned even the Allies. It began with what would later be called the England Spiel, or the England Game. In 1942, the Nazis captured several British agents sent to organize resistance cells in the Netherlands. Instead of executing them immediately, the German Abwehr, the Nazi military intelligence service, saw an opportunity. They forced the captured agents to keep transmitting radio messages back to Britain, pretending that everything was fine. What followed was one of the most devastating deceptions of the entire war. For 2 long years, British intelligence unknowingly sent supplies, weapons, and even new agents straight into the hands of the enemy. Every time an aircraft dropped men or equipment into Dutch fields, the Gestapo was waiting. The result? Dozens of Allied agents captured or killed, and entire resistance networks in the Netherlands wiped out almost overnight. The Nazi intelligence officers behind the operation were cold and meticulous. They even mimicked the captured agent's style of writing to keep British command from suspecting anything. It wasn't until 1944 that the horrifying truth came out. The British had been playing their own game against themselves, but the Nazis' success didn't last forever. Their growing arrogance became their downfall. As the war dragged on, their obsession with control turned their intelligence system inward, breeding paranoia and distrust. They began spying on each other, SS against Gestapo, Gestapo against Abwehr, fracturing the very machine they had built to dominate Europe. Meanwhile, the Allies adapted. They learned from the England Spiel disaster, introducing strict verification codes and layered communication methods to ensure their messages couldn't be faked again. Double agents became a powerful weapon. Figures like Juan Pujol Garcia, known as Agent Garbo, fed the Nazis carefully crafted lies about Allied troop movements. The Germans believed him so completely that they diverted entire divisions to defend against invasions that never came. By the time D-Day arrived, Hitler's armies were looking in the wrong direction. thanks in part to a spy they thought was working for them. As the Nazi counterintelligence apparatus collapsed under its own deceit, resistance networks regained their strength. Messages once intercepted now flowed freely, guiding Allied bombers and ground troops. The same radio waves that had carried traps now carried liberation. By 1945, the Nazi spy hunting machine had turned into a web of confusion and betrayal. The hunters had become the hunted. Their own lies had blinded them, and their once feared intelligence networks crumbled under the weight of deception. But the story doesn't end there. Because all these fragmented efforts, codebreakers, double agents, resistance fighters, and infiltrators, were about to converge in one final act of coordination that would help bring the Nazi regime to its knees. By the final years of World War II, something extraordinary had happened. The vast web of Allied intelligence, once scattered across continents and often working in secret from one another, had finally begun to connect. Codebreakers in Britain, resistance fighters in Europe, double agents in Germany, and operatives in the United States all began moving in rhythm, like gears in a massive hidden machine. And together, they delivered the blows that shattered the Nazi empire from within. It wasn't just about decoding messages or smuggling secrets anymore. It was about coordination. Every intercepted Nazi order, every resistance tip, every fake radio message planted by a double agent fed into a single expanding stream of intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. The most powerful armies in the world were now guided by information pulled from whispers, smuggled papers, and intercepted signals. At Bletchley Park, decoded Enigma messages revealed the movements of U-boats and armored divisions weeks before they attacked. Allied convoys that once sailed blindly through wolf-infested waters now slipped through undetected, saving thousands of lives. On land, information from the French resistance guided bombers to destroy key rail lines and fuel depots, crippling Nazi supply chains before the D-Day invasion. In Germany itself, insiders like members of the Red Orchestra provided early warnings of troop redeployments and even morale inside the Nazi military, helping Allied planners anticipate how far they could push without breaking the resistance of the German army. And then there were the lies, the deliberate misinformation campaigns that made Hitler his own worst enemy. Agents like Garbo in Spain and Tricycle in Portugal fed the Nazis a diet of perfectly believable false reports, all confirming one gigantic illusion, that the Allied invasion of France would strike not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler bought it completely. He left his best tanks and divisions defending the wrong coast. When Allied forces stormed Normandy on June 6, 1944, the beaches were defended, but not by enough. D-Day succeeded not just because of courage or planning, but because of deception. Every piece of intelligence, every coded message, every forged document had built to that moment. It was the climax of years of invisible warfare, one fought not with bullets, but with information. The result? A massive turning point that made the Nazi defeat inevitable. Even after D-Day, the networks didn't stop. Resistance groups across Europe coordinated sabotage missions, cutting off retreat routes, ambushing reinforcements, and disrupting communication lines. Allied intelligence intercepted Hitler's increasingly frantic orders. They watched his empire unravel in real time, city by city, message by message. By 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing not only from the outside, but from within. Its once feared intelligence services were disoriented, outmaneuvered, and drowning in misinformation. The very system that had terrorized Europe was now blind and broken, undone by the networks it had underestimated. And when Berlin finally fell, it wasn't just a victory of armies. It was a victory of intelligence, courage, and silence. The spies, codebreakers, couriers, and double agents who had risked everything didn't fight for glory. They fought for truth. But as history would soon learn, those secret wars didn't end with the fall of the Reich. They simply evolved into something even more shadowy as a new global conflict began to rise from the ashes of the old one. When people talk about World War II, they remember the battles, the beaches, the tanks, the flags raised in victory. But the truth is, much of that victory was written long before the first soldier stepped onto a battlefield. It was written in invisible ink, transmitted through static-filled radio waves, and whispered through walls by people who never saw their names in headlines. The spy networks that took down the Nazis didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march in parades or pose for photographs. They worked in silence, often alone, armed not with rifles, but with typewriters, radios, and courage. They were the code breakers at Bletchley Park, their eyes bloodshot from nights of endless calculations. The couriers on bicycles in the dead of night, carrying false papers through Gestapo checkpoints. The double agents who lied so convincingly that even Hitler himself believed them. Together, they formed one of the most extraordinary human collaborations in history, a war fought entirely in the dark. And while the tanks and planes grabbed the world's attention, these invisible soldiers were the ones who made sure those machines were in the right place, at the right time, with the right information. They turned intelligence into a weapon more powerful than any bomb. Think about it. Without Ultra, the Allies would have walked blind into ambushes. Without the resistance, escape lines, and insider spies, Europe's underground would have stayed silent, and D-Day might have been a disaster. Without double agents feeding false reports to Berlin, the Nazis might have held their strongest armies exactly where the invasion landed. Every hidden act, every coded message, every risk taken in silence chipped away at one of the most terrifying regimes in history until the walls finally cracked. And yet, when the war ended, most of these people vanished back into obscurity. Their files were locked away. Their stories were classified. For decades, their names barely surfaced in history books. But their legacy lived on. The same systems they built, the coordination between intelligence, technology, and resistance, became the blueprint for the Cold War spy networks that followed. The Invisible War didn't end in 1945. It simply changed enemies. Maybe that's the most haunting truth of all. Every major conflict since has been shaped by lessons learned in that secret war. The battle for information never really stopped. It just went deeper underground. So the next time you hear about World War II, remember the people who fought in silence. The ones who never fired a shot but still helped win the war. Because their victory wasn't measured in miles of land or cities conquered. It was measured in secrets stolen, lives saved, and the freedom they quietly helped preserve. In the end, the greatest weapon against tyranny wasn't a gun, it was intelligence. And sometimes, the most heroic battles are the ones the world never sees.